Greg Barton is Professor of Global Islamic Politics at the Alfred Deakin Institute and one of Australia's leading commentators on international affairs and terrorism. He regularly appears throughout the media as an expert commentator on a wide range of issues, such as his level of expertise. A regular on The Informer, Professor Barton joins us via Zoom today to talk about terrorism, COVID and the apparent decline in terrorist activity because of the pandemic and whether there is an actual direct correlation between this and the decline in activity. Good morning, Professor Barton. How are you?
Good morning. Great to join you, Michael.
So is there an actual decline, or is it just because COVID seems to have taken front and centre in most of the media?
I think it's much more about the second, about the perception, Michael, and it depends where you're looking. If we were sitting in northern Iraq or northern Syria, I don't think we'd be talking about things getting better, because what we've seen in Iraq particularly is Islamic State, which is now an insurgency underground, taking advantage of COVID suppression methods. So it depends where you are. Africa too, I think similar story. Mozambique, Mali, that's hardly declined. Somalia, Nigeria. But in the West, in Western capitals, where our news cycle can only really think of one thing at a time, now it's the COVID-19 focus. And partly because of that shift of focus, but also because we have got domestic intelligence, policing, counterterrorism pretty well nailed. So apart from the ongoing threat of lone actors, we sort of figured out how to lower the immediate risk from terrorism. So that's not a new thing. But I think to understand the nature of the threat, we've got to look at the global dynamics.
So, Professor, the recent withdrawal of America and Australia from Afghanistan in the area, is that going to be problematic, do you think?
Sadly, Michael, that's almost definitely going to be disastrous. It's just a question of the degree of disaster. The real concern with Afghanistan as being a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, Islamic State and other groups. The Taliban are domestically focused, but they're joined at the hip with Al-Qaeda. And circumstances give space to Islamic State, which splits off from the Taliban. We went in there 20 years ago, of course, within weeks of the 9/11 attacks, to go after the Al-Qaeda leadership, specifically bin Laden, and deny Al-Qaeda safe haven in Afghanistan. That part of the mission worked reasonably well. They did flee to the eastern mountains, but most of the leadership was destroyed or eliminated. Unfortunately, the rest of the Afghan story fell apart, distracted by Iraq. Other problems arose on that front as well. So 20 years on, it's not a surprise that President Biden wants to dial down operations. He's been talking about that, literally since 2002, his first visit there. But it's the way the transition's been managed or not managed. You could shoot a lot of blame at the government in Kabul, no question about that. Corrupt, incompetent, divided. You could shoot a lot of blame at the Pakistani military that's long played games in Afghanistan with the Taliban. But I think really we've got to recognize that we haven't managed the transition well. We owe a duty of care to the Afghan people, and we are completely failing in that. Pulling out of Bagram Air Base meant that 18,000 civilian contractors left, and they are the guys that keep the Black Hawk helicopters and the C-130 transport aircraft flying. And it's those basic transport aircraft that are critical to any sort of Afghan military operations against the Taliban in a mountainous country. But to go back to the thrust of your question, it looks like 20 years on from 9/11, Afghanistan is becoming once again a safe haven for Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. There are reports of thousands of foreign fighters fighting with the Taliban brought in by Al-Qaeda, not confirmed. But there's no reason to be confident that those porous borders won't see a lot of foreign fighters returning to Afghanistan, as they did in the 80s and early 90s. That was the birth of Al-Qaeda, the birth of Jamaat Islamiyah and other regional terror networks, and it just seems to be being repeated all again.
Is this going to be a festering problem that's going to come back to bite us with this withdrawal? Are they going to stay in their own state now and do the damage there, or do you think they'll eventually reach out as they were doing earlier?
Well, it's a good question, Michael. With Afghanistan, there's always been a lot of wishful thinking. And if you listen to the sort of more wistful optimists, they would say, look, the Taliban are domestic. They'll focus on domestic problems. It's bad for Afghanistan. We wish it was otherwise, but they're not going to launch international attacks. Now, there's a couple of things we need to understand. One is that in all around the world, not just in Western capitals, also in Indonesia and Malaysia, Police have got very good at intelligence and disrupting large, ambitious plots. So we've seen the Al-Qaeda attacks of the first decade of the century eliminated. Islamic State rose, it presented new threats. Part of that threat was lone actors. But basically, we've managed to control ambitious terrorist plotting in global cities. But that doesn't mean that Al-Qaeda or Islamic State have gone away. Best estimates suggest that Al-Qaeda is 3 times the size it was at the time of the 9/11 attacks, that it's got a considerable force strength, maybe 30,000, 40,000 fighters. About a decade ago, they pivoted towards engaging with global local insurgencies. So a global insurgency, but focused on engaging locally. So look recently at Mozambique, which was Islamic State, or West Africa, which tends to be heavily Al-Qaeda, Somalia with Shabab Al-Qaeda, and you see the sort of problems coming. We saw this not that long ago in Mindanao, where Islamic State joined with local Philippines separatist forces, Abu Sayyaf group, and that resulted in the largest Muslim city, Marawi, being bombed to smithereens and destroyed. That's what we're going to see coming, because all of this began with so-called foreign fighters, Mujahideen, going to Afghanistan to ostensibly to fight, but mostly to train, then take the jihad home. And that cycle seems to be repeated now. So we're getting mixed messages, because we got bored of this long fight. We're tired of it. We're fatigued. We've seen police do really good work in preventing terror attacks. And we say, look, it's all over. But you look at the global picture, look at Africa, Asia, Middle East, it's not over. And you look at the underlying conditions that enabled this, it's not over. And Afghanistan is the pivot point. Afghanistan, I think, is going to lead to a sustained upswing of terrorist activity globally over the coming decade. And we're going to say, how could this be possible? We didn't see it coming, but it's entirely predictable.
Yeah. Do we have any information on how they're managing the pandemic?
The Afghan government?
Yes.
Barely. They're not managing the pandemic. In Australia, we've got well-equipped, extensive public service machinery, medical experts, stable democracy, and the struggles we have in Australia. It's hard, and the Delta variant makes it even that much harder. But then you look at Afghanistan, which is, half of the country needs humanitarian support just to get enough food. There's chronic malnutrition. They're on the edge of disaster, partly because of this Taliban advance, but other factors as well. The government's incompetent, it's corrupt, it's divided, it lacks legitimacy, and they no longer control the national ring road. So they depend on air support to islands of cities that are otherwise surrounded by the Taliban. So when you think about that, COVID-19 is not going well. The only reason we don't hear more about it is because information flows are limited and attention is distracted by what's happening with the Taliban.
Any other state actors supporting the different sides and encouraging them as well, Professor?
Yeah, this is a really complex mess, but it's the perfect storm. So the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, ISI, in Pakistan has for decades believed that it can help Pakistani security, well, maybe more cynically, the careers of some in the military and the government, by using proxy elements, using groups that it raises up, like Lashkar-e-Toiba, but also the Afghan Taliban. Problem for them is the Afghan Taliban hide the Pakistani Taliban. So you've got historically the leadership of the Afghan Taliban living in cities like Quetta with family and having access to education and medical services that sustains them. And then the Pakistan Taliban hiding out in Afghanistan. ISI in Pakistan has really miscalculated this. It's going to come around and bite them, even though at the moment there are some voices in Pakistan rather triumphant with what's happening, but it's not to anyone's good. China likewise talks about engaging with Afghanistan, benefiting from trade. China has exaggerated and badly managed the threat of terrorism in Xinjiang in particular. But next door to Xinjiang, there's a very real monster in the form of the Taliban, which they really don't want to deal with, despite diplomatic missions and photo ops in China. So China's going to find it very hard. I think China has the potential to play a really constructive role, but that's problematic. Iran isn't happy, can't be happy with what's happening next door. It's threatened to cut off important trade flows, access to foreign currency, which is a really key element in Iran. But Iran has given sanctuary, at least the Revolutionary Corps Guard has given a sanctuary to some of the Al-Qaeda leadership. You know, you could say it's house arrest, management, whatever, but they've given a space for the Al-Qaeda leaders to hide out. And I fear that they will figure they can cynically get some calculation between Al-Qaeda and Taliban to their advantage, but they're not a helpful element, as we see in Iraq and Syria. You know, to give credit, yes, they helped defeat Islamic State, but they're now part of the problem, and that's not even getting onto Hezbollah in Lebanon. And then Central Asia is a more constructive element. I think America's counting on Central Asia, Tajikistan and other republics to be launching points to help the Afghan government and the military, but that's not clear either. India would and should play a constructive role, but India really hasn't managed this as well as it could. And this perennial conflict between India and Pakistan spoils everything, and that's part of the factor that just means that Afghanistan hasn't been as well managed as it should have been.
Well, there we have it, folks. It's slightly foreboding story from Professor Barton. Thanks very much for your time, Professor.
Pleasure, Michael. Great to speak with you. Thanks very much.